Anastasia, you once said that if a person does not develop spiritually, then his energy structure in the subsequent dimensions, above the sixth, is simplified. Rigden, for the observer from higher dimensions, any person in the first dimension represents, speaking in human associations, an ordinary dot, in other words, nothing. It is important to note that a person who does not develop spiritually, despite the fact that his structure is much more sophisticated in the material world and in the sixth dimension it has the shape of a pyramid, in the seventh dimension, his energy structure looks like a nebula, or rather a blurred spot which becomes further simplified in the subsequent higher dimensions. And finally, in the 72nd dimension, a spiritually undeveloped person represents, just like in the first dimension, only a dot, nothing. And in this lies the answer to the most important question of any human. I hope that intelligent people will understand it. Observing from the seventh dimension of the material world is already like, so to speak, contemplating the muddy waters of a swamp by the one who is standing on the shore. Just like the material world, the swamp is a natural cleaner of the system, a filter for cleaning water, in other words, that which forms the basis of life. Complex processes take place in its depth, but the observer is only interested in their result which appears on the surface of the murky waters. Many people who have lived their lives in vain, unable to succeed in using their spiritual chance, are like bubbles floating to the surface, filled with the void of desires of the material world. Their fate on the surface of the water is sad and predetermined. Upon touching a qualitatively different environment, the bubbles burst, turning into nothing. But there are those who, having merged with their soul during life, are like a beautiful lotus bud appearing on the surface out of the murky waters. This snow-white flower captivates the observer's attention with its purity and novelty. The observer admires the beauty of the flower and gives it his attention, watching the process of the unfolding of each petal. A lotus flower is qualitatively different from an empty bubble of air, for it has already become an integral part of another world. Another way of saying it is if a person develops spiritually and his aspirations and desires are connected with the world of God, in other words, the spiritual nature dominates in him, then eventually he will be able to escape the restrictions of the material world, 6 dimensions, during his life and enter the 7th dimension. In this case, his energy structure becomes more complex in the 7th dimension. If we speak about these complex energy processes in associations that are understandable for the mind of a resident of a 3-dimensional world, then a person's structure transforms from the pyramidal shape to the shape of a cube set on one of its corners. In other words, the energy structure of such a spiritually liberated person is qualitatively different from the pyramid-shaped energy structure of an ordinary person in the 6th dimension. And the further a person delves into the spiritual self-development, the more complex his energy structure becomes. Such a transformed energy structure of a human is impossible to miss for those who have a true spiritual vision. The pyramidal energy structure of man occupies much more space than the physical body, and the cubic one occupies 10 times as much. This unique phenomenon is hard to miss at the level of energy, even from the perspective of the observer of higher dimensions. As they say, the true holiness of human will not escape the sight of the observer from the spiritual nature. But, unfortunately, in the human society, such a transformation is very rare. By the way, in the ancient times, the people who attained the 7th dimension and received spiritual liberation during lifetime were symbolically portrayed in the shape of a cube, often with a mark painted on one of its corners. A supreme being from the spiritual world was also marked with the same symbol. Anastasia, yes, this is indeed a very interesting topic. In regards to this, there exists rich and varied archaeological material that confirms the existence of such a symbolism among many ancient peoples living on different continents. Rigden, of course, we will return to this subject many times in the course of the conversation. Unfortunately, as of today a lot of the original information has been lost or forgotten, therefore, many discovered artifacts, which recorded the ancient knowledge in symbols and signs, are still not completely understood by scientists. Anastasia, you're right. In order to understand this, one needs to have basic knowledge. I remember when you first told us about humans' energy structure. For me, it was not a mere revelation, but a real shock which later, in the process of analysis of the information and its deep understanding, developed into a mature brand new view of the world. I am sure that others will not be indifferent to this information. Could you tell the readers more about man, in particular how his energy structure becomes more complex in each subsequent dimension? Rigdon, in order for people to realize what their energy structure represents in 6 dimensions and how it is all interconnected, I will give a simple associative example. There is a children's toy, a kaleidoscope. This is a tube, inside which mirrors and colored stones are placed at a certain angle. As the tube is rotated, you can observe varying combinations of patterns. The more mirrors there are, the more complex the observed patterns and shapes are. So, in our case, the mirrors are dimensions and the stones are the main parts of the energy structure of a human. Their number is stable, but any qualitative change in the process of spiritual perfection leads to a more complex transformation of the whole structure. If we view the structure of human being in the first dimension, one-dimensional world, then it will look like a dot similar to a star in the sky. And if you zoom in on this dot and then delve into its structure, you are able to see the entire complexity of the energy structure of human being. In other words, to trace a connection from the first dimension to the last through the whole successive chain of dimensions. Figuratively speaking, it is similar to contemplating stars. If you look at it with the naked eye, it will just be a barely visible point in the sky. But if you look at it through a spyglass, it will be visible as a rough bright circle. And if you observe it through a powerful telescope, then it will be a sufficiently complex space object with volume and its own natural processes. And in the second dimension, two-dimensional world, the structure of a person will have a shape of a cross, in the middle of which there will be a circle at the intersection of its lines. Well, and everybody knows what a person looks like in the third dimension. Anastasia, that is so. But even in this example, you understand how complex human structure is even in the three-dimensional world. After all, what I see in the mirror is far from all that there really is both inside of me and outside, if we take into account not only the inner life of the organism as a closed environment but also the weak energy fields that it produces. In today's world, people do not know much about how their body is organized in the three-dimensional world, not to mention more. So for them, it may be surprising to hear the information about a simultaneous and stable existence of the person in 6 dimensions. Although in a way, you can understand those people who have lived most of their lives believing this world to be the only reality. Many questions from the mind arise if one does not have practical spiritual experience. How can this be, due to what these connections occur, and so on. Rigdon, in such cases, as a rule, the animal nature activates first, not wanting to lose its power over a person, immediately creating a lack of acceptance and incomprehension in him, and forcing him into the old and familiar stalls of thinking of the citizen of a three-dimensional world. However, it is impossible to fully know the higher dimensions and get personal experience while remaining in the limited state of consciousness of the observer of the three-dimensional world. In this respect, I will give a simple example. Imagine that you are observing processes that are happening to residents of a two-dimensional world. In the human understanding, a two-dimensional world represents a plane characterized by length and width. In short, residents of a two-dimensional world do not understand what volume is. Imagine that they see a translucent space object in the form of a cone or a sphere approaching their world. What will they see? Instead of a cone, they will see a two-dimensional figure, that is, a circle and a point in the middle, and instead of a ball, they will see just a circle. Why? Because their thinking is tuned to the perception of a two-dimensional world. The concept of 3 dimensions is beyond their comprehension of the world as creatures living in 2-dimensional space and observing from it. In other words, they do not see the real picture because it is beyond their dimension, beyond their usual state of consciousness which has specific limits. And now let us get back to our three-dimensional space. Today, people behave in the same way, they explore the world from the perspective of a resident of three-dimensional space. But man, unlike other creatures from other dimensions, has a unique energy structure, thanks to which, by developing himself spiritually, he is able to know other dimensions and see the world as it is in reality and not in the narrow range of the limited perception of the world as part of three-dimensional space. Anastasia, in general, what people usually see around them, perceive in each day, including themselves, is not such in reality. Rigdon, absolutely. Our brain, or to be more precise, its usual state of consciousness, is a kind of a barrier to knowing more, knowing what lies beyond the three-dimensional space. After all, man's usual state of consciousness, as I have already said, is programmed from birth to the limited perception of a three-dimensional world, to put it more precisely, even partially of a four-dimensional world. Three-dimensional space and time are meant here. The fourth dimension, time, as a factor of measurement, is hardly understood or perceived by man. In other words, in three-dimensional space, we perceive ourselves constantly here and now at a given point. In everyday life, the brain does not notice this movement in time, the very isoosmos with cause and effect relations. Man notices the general movement of time, perhaps, only when he assesses himself, for example, while looking in the mirror, or compares his photographs of 20 years ago with how he looks now. But our brain, while in a usual state of consciousness, does not notice the constant movement of time, of life itself as isoosmos, an inner impulse of energy. But this does not mean that a person cannot perceive it at all. After all, the human perception depends, first of all, on the dominant worldview, the stability of the state of expanded consciousness, on the database that man inputs into his brain and constantly updates, and that is why it is important to expand your intellectual horizons. Secondly, such a perception depends on self-development, on systematic experiences of altered states of consciousness, meditations and spiritual practices, thanks to which man independently learns about the world outside of the three dimensions, and not with the mind's logic but with a more perfect instrument of his, the intuitive sense, the sixth sense. Anastasia, yes, such sayings of people from the ancient times as when man changes, the whole world changes, know thyself, and you shall know the whole world are not empty words. This is a reality, the fullness of which man can acknowledge during the practical process of spiritual self-discovery. You once mentioned, while talking about altered states of consciousness, that human consciousness has many levels. Rigdon, that is right. The fact that consciousness has many levels allows the person as an observer, even from the animal nature, to embrace with his perception from the second up to the sixth dimensions, specifically in an altered state of consciousness. Man cannot consciously perceive the first dimension. For him, it will just be a dot, nothing. But this nothing holds everything. The first dimension is the isoosmos, in other words, the initial inner impulse of energy. As a rule, man does not consciously notice the beginning of this change, impulse, especially at the level of the first dimension. Concerning the first dimension, I will give a metaphorical example that will be understood by many people today. It is related to the work of computers, or rather, to the movement of the blinking screen indicator, the cursor. By the way, the word cursor comes from the Latin word cursorius, which means messenger, speed walker, fast runner. When you do something on the computer, for example, you edit text, you move this pointer indicator, an arrow or a dash, on the display screen by pressing certain keys or with an optical and mechanical manipulator, a mouse. After all, while doing it, you are not thinking how exactly it moves, you just do it almost automatically because you are focused on your work. It only seems to you that the cursor moves naturally when you control the mouse, for example, to select or move the text, correct it, or open a new window. But what is really happening? The screen consists of pixels, that is, these small colored dots which, if magnified, will look like squares, like a squared notebook, each of which consists of 3 colors, subpixels, red, green, and blue. Combining these 3 primary colors at each point makes it possible to reproduce any color on the monitor screen. The more pixels there are in the same area of the screen, the better and sharper, more detailed, the image on it will be. What is a pixel? It is just an element of a photosensitive matrix, the smallest element of a two-dimensional digital image in a pixel grid, in bitmapped graphics, on the monitor screen. This is a set of electrodes. What is displaying image on the screen? It is, in fact, control of electrical voltage that is applied to each electrode, light-emitting diode. The size and direction of the vector of the electric field, in its turn, is controlled by the software component and the processor of the graphics card. When you move a mouse with your hand, the electrical signals from the optical sensor go via USB, a device for transmitting information, to that part of the computer circuitry that is responsible for processing them. The processed signal is sent to the video card. Then, according to its program, it changes the characteristics of the electric field applied to specific electrodes, LEDs, on the screen, pixels. Accordingly, their light intensity changes, for example, some become black and others white. For you, it creates an illusion of the cursor's movement on the screen. In other words, you only think that you move the cursor. In fact, thanks to the work of electronic circuits and programs, you only change external conditions for the electrode, LED, and it acquires new properties for itself. And because of that, the light passing through it acquires other characteristics, frequency and intensity. If the cursor is located at a given point at given moment in time, then, by performing an impulse, having moved the mouse with your hand, you create conditions for changing the optical characteristics of the dot. Anastasia, one can say that, in a way, I trigger the jump of the cursor from one point to another, from one pixel to another. Rigdon, yes. The movement of the cursor is, in essence, a figurative example of the prototype of unnoticeable motion, life, of the material body in space and time, thanks to the isoosmos. Isoosmos is a jump of information from one information building block to another. An information building block pulls in the information and passes it to another information block, in other words, it transmits the information through itself. Those pixels serve as information building blocks in our conditional comparison. But you as an observer, thanks to your freedom of choice, trigger this movement in one direction or another. All this movement happens according to the change of information and goes unnoticed by the person who does not see the complex mechanism of change and transmission of information. In our example, you just move the mouse and for you, there is a natural movement on the screen. You do not see how the cursor picture jumps from one pixel to another, how voltage changes in each electrode. For you, the cursor arrow almost instantly moves to another position on the screen. Same in life, the movement of any material object through information blocks goes unnoticed by a person. He does not see how exactly this initial movement happens at the level of the first dimension. For example, we see a person walking in a certain direction. What really happens is that information with all its complexity of interconnections is flowing through information building blocks thanks to isoosmos. Even if we watch a man sitting motionless, in fact, this is just an illusion because actually, a very rich intensive informational exchange is taking place which is his life, his movement which remains unnoticed either by him or by us. Anastasia, in other words, a person may not realize the full complexity of the world's influence on him and his influence on the world, but changes at the invisible level are happening constantly. Rigdon, and the higher the dimension, for example, the fifth, the sixth, from which a person instigates these changes with his choice, the more significant these changes will be. Anastasia, the main function of the first dimension is the initial inner impetus of energy. Could you tell the readers what is the main function of the second dimension? Rigden. For a person, in his perception, the functions of the second dimension, two-dimensional space, represent nothing more than a kind of storage and transmission of information in which signs and symbols play a significant role. Although functions of the second dimension are much broader. Here is a simple example. Any record presumes storage and transfer of information. What is a script, whether pictographic, ideographic, hieroglyphic or alphabetical? It is a signed system of recording human thoughts which allows one to capture them in time and transmit them over distance through conventional notation. In other words, it is a notation in the two-dimensional world which involves storing information in certain symbols and signs. For example, a cake recipe, or a guide for construction of a nuclear power plant, or an outline of making a nuclear bomb, and so on. If you were able to read the recipe and made no attempt to do anything, then nothing will happen. But if you can read, that is, you understand the notation of symbols, but then you apply an appropriate force following the instructions and act, then you will invariably get the result recorded in this recipe or manual. So with the sign of a two-dimensional world, if you add energy to it, acting out of a three-dimensional world, it will start working. As a result, according to our example, after applying energy and acting upon the information from the second dimension, we will get either a cake, or light in the house, or the result that will destroy our house in the third dimension. Anastasia. So, generally speaking, the third dimension is the dimension in which you already apply force and energy and begin to create. Rigden. For a human, yes. In this regard, it is important for people to understand what kind of information they give their attention to in each day, to what they apply their life force, how exactly they subsequently waste it, and what they can really achieve. After all, today most people observe themselves, and consequently assess their lives, one-sidedly, only from the perspective of thinking of a resident of three-dimensional space. A modern person does not even realize that the origin of his thoughts is related to a completely different dimension. However, he is constantly living in his dreams and thoughts while the surrounding reality for him is the reflection of his mental activity, to some extent. He is wasting his life energy on materialization of his thoughts and desires which are mainly related to a very narrow spectrum of a broad band of frequencies of three-dimensional space on which his observation as the personality is focused at a given moment. Anastasia, you have emphasized the fact that a person, as an observer, triggers these changes with his choice in this or that direction. And it is he who is the observer. And it is he who triggers, in other words, additionally stimulates something that already exists. Rigden. Absolutely. Man constantly chooses between the spiritual world, with its force coming from the soul, and the material world with its phantom games of the animal mind which, one way or another, tries to redirect the life energy of a person for its own needs. These are the two dominant forces that create in the material world in this peculiar conditional confrontation, and man, as an observer, is only placed on the edge of choice between them. Moreover, for the beings of the material world who make up a part of the animal mind, these forces are invisible, but they are fateful for human because there is a part of an eternity, the soul, in him, and he has an opportunity to become an immortal spiritual being. Anastasia, therefore, the main determining moment for a person is what thoughts and actions he pays attention to in his everyday. Rigden. That is absolutely correct. For better understanding, I will illustrate with a figurative example of an internet user what a person's choice between the two dominant forces is. When a person focuses his primary attention on something, in other words, makes a choice, he does not see how he triggers the beginning of these changes in the first dimension by doing this. In our example, this is equivalent to pressing the start button of a computer which starts processes that are invisible to a person. So, it is the person's attention that starts the process of movement at the level of the first dimension. Everything starts with it. This initial attention of the personality is the primary force of the observer. This is his freedom. Where you direct your primary attention is what you activate. Man does not realize the full significance of the actions that have happened at the level of the first dimension, but later he feels the consequences they have on his fate as quite real. When a person turns on a computer, as a consequence, characters and symbols of different programs that store certain information appear on the screen after a while. And if it is, for example, the internet, then before the user's eyes, a set of characters and symbols appears, behind each of which a more voluminous layer of information is hidden. The internet, in general, represents a complex interconnection with the world, but, through different root, base, servers belonging to certain authoritative organizations and people who fund them secretly or openly. All this is based on the distribution of this or that ideology. By the way, such a notion as a domain name, which is today known to any resident of the internet, comes from the Latin word dominium meaning possession. As a rule, an internet user does not stop and think about all this, diving into the stream of information provided for him to choose from. He sees details, but he does not see the whole picture, though he should. So then, the appearance of signs, symbols, various computer programs, and short advertising texts of the internet which hide whole layers of information behind them, all this is like interaction of the person's attention with information at the level of the second dimension. In the material world, if one considers all the information of the second dimension globally, this will only be a different form of manifestation of programs either from the animal nature or from the spiritual nature. Man has the freedom of choice. And while something out of this simply attracts his attention, something else holds it. As a result, out of all the variety, just like in an internet search engine, he opens only that information, focusing on it, which has attracted his attention the most. From the perspective of the third dimension, man makes his choice with this. In other words, he activates the process of obtaining information in the second dimension. By activating this information, he begins to live by it at the level of the third dimension. In other words, as a personality, he lets this flow of information into himself and it manifests itself in the form of various images, emotions, desires, and thoughts in the consciousness, and it begins to live in him. Like in a sentient being. This pushes the person to specific actions within the program of this will from the outside. The very one of the many programs by which this will has drawn his attention to itself in the second dimension. As soon as he lets them in, this becomes equivalent to his giving preference to work in this or that program and starting to move the cursor there, his attention, engaging different functions, mental images, desires, and emotions. And moving the cursor, as I have already said, equals to the creation, thanks to the izoismus, of actions that are invisible to man at the first stages but which then become events of his fate. Consciously, neither in the first dimension nor in the dimensions above, does a person perceive what exactly he changes by applying the power of his attention to the program that he has chosen. But he, as a personality who has made a choice at a given point of time, is wasting his life force on materializing this will from the outside, working according to this program. Anastasia, and this point is very important. If we consider it globally, it turns out that we only think that we have will in the meaning of a force of creation, creating activity of the mind, or, as they say in psychology, as a self-sufficient, having quite an independent meaning, source of human activity which determines the independence of behavior from objective reasons. It is interesting that those same psychologists relate will to control of your own behavior which, they believe, becomes possible thanks to the use of artificial means of conduct, signs. Rigdon, what we believe to be our own will is an illusion of our perception from the perspective of thinking of an individual mind of a three-dimensional world. If we consider our example, a person just activates the incoming flow of information with his choice and spends his life force on realization of this will. Will, whether emanating from the spiritual nature, the world of God, or coming from the animal nature, the animal mind, is a force from the outside or, rather, an information program implemented in a certain structure that carries it out. The substitution. from the animal mind lies in the fact that the personality of the person perceives the forms of manifestation of one of these two global forces as his own will, which in fact it does not have. Anastasia, in other words, what a person believes to be his own will and what he is excessively proud of, is not his own. It's just a force that has entered him from the outside by means of the information he has chosen. It activates feelings, emotions, and thoughts in him that spur him on to certain actions within the program of this will, which is related to expenditures of life energy. Rigdon, quite right. People, while under the influence of pride from the animal nature, love to liken themselves to higher forces endowed with their own will. But not everyone asks themselves the questions, by whose will do that particular action happen, who spurs me on to these thoughts, who gives rise to these particular desires, who in me is resisting and who is asking these questions and who is replying to them. And there are very few of those who sort themselves out, understanding the process of confrontation between the animal nature and the spiritual nature, between the will emanating from the spiritual world and the will from the animal mind. Of course, the animal mind is strong, but it cannot be compared to the primary force of the world of God. If the latter manifests itself clearly, the animal mind cannot resist it directly, but it can distract its conductor, the person standing on the spiritual path, with its trifles in order to throw him off the right course, catch him with another illusion, and so on. The beginnings of manifestation of will in terms of creation appear in a person only when he, maturing spiritually, comes out from under the power of the animal mind, that is, when he leaves the sixth dimension, getting into the seventh. And even then, it will not be a manifestation of will as such in the current human understanding, but simply a new quality and expansion of the abilities of the conductor of the divine will. Anastasia, yes, such substitutions from the animal mind accompany human, as a being that lives in the material world, at every step. If a person does not work on himself, he is simply wasting his life on material desires, on the temporal and the mortal. Rigdon, on the one hand, a common person yearns to influence events of his life, craves for changes of his fate for the better. But these are all needs of the spiritual side which his brain successfully turns towards the animal nature. As a result of this reversed understanding, people crave for freedom in terms of matter instead of the spiritual freedom. They crave wealth, fame, satisfaction of their selfishness, and abundance in their temporary existence. If a person focuses on his material desires for a long time and makes a lot of efforts to fulfill them from one year to the next, then sooner or later a series of events happen which leads to the desired result, even when by that time the person no longer needs it. In other words, a personality may have a certain impact on the three-dimensional world, achieve what it desires, but this process is accompanied by huge expenditures of effort and energy and takes a long time. However, the question here is different: is it worth spending one's life and great potential on achieving the temporary material wishes of the body? Anastasia, some readers are asking, what is the meaning of my life? Why am I here? Am I really here just to plant a tree, build a house, and raise children? And in their thoughts, they themselves respond that if that were the main purpose of man's existence on earth, then, first of all, he would not need such a complex structure of matter, including such an overabundant organization of the brain which includes various levels of the state of consciousness. Second, it would be logical to assume that everyone who already has a house, children, and a personal garden would be happy and satisfied with their lives. But in general, these people ask such age-old questions without finding satisfaction in achieving the desires of their youth. Rigdon, the meaning of man's life is not at all in reproduction and improvement of his material living conditions. These are just natural instincts of any animal which is genetically programmed to create a burrow, or build a nest, and so on, in order to raise offspring. Man is more than an animal, his purpose is to become a spiritual immortal being. But in chasing his material desires, man irrevocably squanders two valuable factors, time and life energy. I draw your attention to the fact that they are spent irrevocably, and, consequently, certain possibilities are lost. In his choice, man is free, of course, to fritter away the life force that he has on the programs of the animal nature in this illusory three-dimensional space. But as a result, he will miss the most important thing for which he has come into this world. And after all, man is given as much time and as much energy as he needs to free his soul, and even above that, more than enough for possible errors in the process of getting personal experience by his personality. Figuratively speaking, time and life energy are like gasoline for a car, the body, which is enough to drive exactly from point A to point B, with small deviations, given the complexity of the way. But if you go in the opposite direction instead, if you dedicate your life to the whims of your material, for example, go to tune up your car, to satisfy the ego, by the master, the animal nature, then, as a result, you will run out of time and energy allocated to you. Eventually, you will lie so beautiful at a car junkyard, of subpersonalities, just like the others around you, rusting and rotting. But you could have purposefully used that time and energy to get to destination B, where your final transformation into a completely different being, a spiritual being, would have taken place. Anastasia, as you once said, whatever little world of personal power man has built for himself in the material world, it is temporal and transient. Everything in this world has an end, entire galaxies, stars, and planets are destroyed, and the human body is all the more mortal. Rigdon, it is difficult for people to understand that their existence is momentary and they are afraid to even think about death. But death for man is just another form of life, it is the result of his lifetime choice. For a person in whom animal nature dominates, it is difficult to realize that there is something bigger than this material world. But when the personality works on itself and, as a result, gets in touch with the spiritual world, then it comes to realize that it is the spiritual world that is the real and the main creating force, and everything else in a person's life is just games of the animal mind, a chase after an elusive illusion.